Yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Ogles, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. I think, by and large, we all agree that CISA should be reauthorized. So then the question becomes, how do we make it better? I know there's been some calls, let's do a clean reauth and just get it out the door quickly. But, as we look at the landscape as we go forward, obviously, in battlefield terms, as warfare has changed, I would argue that one of those battlefields is in the cyber realm. So, Mr. Miller, I know you've had some suggestions, in particular, some of the definitions as it pertains to CISA. Any thoughts on how we can improve as we go into reauthorization to make it better, stronger, more robust?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yeah, I did include some recommendations in my statement. I do think, in general, the approach that we should be taking if we're looking at changes is to just ask a pretty simple question. Hey, what's changed in the past 10 years from a threat standpoint, from a technology standpoint? Are there very technical definitions that we have of cyber threat indicator and defensive measures in the bill? Do they really account for all the different types of attacks that companies are experiencing today? And are we sharing the types of threat information that we need to counteract those threats? I think one example of a relatively novel type of attack that's grown to prominence, someone mentioned SolarWinds earlier, right? Supply chain attacks, software supply chain attacks. Right now, if a company knows that there is a suspect supplier in its supply chain, it doesn't get the type of liability protections that CISA provides to share that sort of information, right? So if you were thinking about making surgical, precise, edits or changes to the bill, again, I would not open it up entirely, but you could look at things like the definition of cyber threat indicator, which has, 7 or 8 subparts, and you could perhaps add something like derogatory information about a supplier in your supply chain or something like that. And that's just an example, but that's the general type of approach I would take rather than making wholesale changes to update the law.
Well, kind of going back to Mr. Jimenez's point, I think one of the things we need to look at is better information sharing, broadening the scope of who might be included, but then with that, you probably need, to your point, the liability protections to protect someone as they're sharing information that otherwise might be, So what about the JCDC? What role might they play as we go forward?
Yeah, as others have testified to, the JCDC is a very valuable, newer partnership that CISA has led, obviously. It's really focused on operational collaboration as opposed to simply sharing information, right? And that's really what this is all about. I will say, it is my understanding that you really could not have JCDC still, without the liability protections that exist in CISA 15, though, right? There are MOUs that companies that participate in JCDC sign, but that really deals more with information dissemination and adhering to pretty strict traffic light protocols. It doesn't have anything to do with the fundamental liability protections and authorizations that CISA provides for sharing the threat information in the first place, which at the end of the day is what underpins JCDC, I would say.
Ms. Ronaldo, you touched on China in rather stark terms. You just want to give us a quick brief of, are we adequately protecting ourselves with CISA and the reauthorization as it pertains in terms of China and obviously their bad actions as it
absolutely. And when we were doing our fact-finding mission, as we were drafting the legislation, one thing that was very abundantly clear is that more than 90% of our networks are held by the private sector. So what can we do as a government to help protect the private sector? So the idea of information sharing and the importance of government to business, and I think, to your question to John, how do we improve the transport of information from the government to business. I would say that was one part that's lacking today, and not necessarily you don't need a congressional change to make that happen, just oversight. How could we stay on top of the agencies to make sure that they're pushing out information? And then I would also say security clearances is a big issue. You may have people that can get a clearance, go into a room, hear the information, but do you have the engineers that can actually act on it? So that's an important aspect as well.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I know I'm out of time, but I would just say to all the witnesses, if you have any suggestions or recommendations that might be specific as to how we make it better, now would be the time to provide that input. So if you would like to send that to my office or, of course, to anyone on the committee, the chairman, happy to take a look at that, incorporate it, because obviously, as we look to the future, as we look to the future of warfare, this is one of those battlefronts, and we need to be ready, we need to be proactive, we need to be ahead of the AI curve. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you for your graciousness.
Gentleman yields back. I